Back to our normal setting for our best decks roundup this week. Let's go ahead and jump right into it, shall we? We kick off my Jeff's picks this week with a fantastically fun Strong Guy Disruption deck that I found success with on the ladder in the past and used this latest variation to get an infinite Conquest win with on stream this week. The relative idea here is straightforward. We have Strong Guy in tandem with either Blade or Lady Sif to not only help our hand get empty, giving us a 3/9, but also make it so Proxima Midnight slams down on the board, adding surprise extra stats to boot. We pair the stat sticks with some ongoing disruptive cards, things like Goose, Cosmo, Armor, US Agent, and Storm's location restricting ability kind of push our opponent around on where they can put their cards into play and makes them less effective in the locations that they're able to deploy to. We round out the last couple of slots in the deck with Nebula, who's a phenomenal stat stick that synergizes with Storm, as well as Jeff and Nocturne, who give us utility to move around the board, get extra points into the Storm path on the last turn, and make it difficult for our opponents to know exactly where our points are going to end up at. As far as Series 4 and 5 replacements go for this deck, you definitely need Proxima Midnight, and I would wager Nebula and Nocturne as well are pretty important to find success with this archetype. Jeff, the baby land shark, could easily be substituted for Nightcrawler, and US Agent can be replaced by something like Maximus, who's a cheap card that puts big numbers into play on the last turn of the game, similar to US Agent. My second Jeff's pick this week is a little Bass deck that plays a variety of cards that start small enough to benefit from Bass setting their base power to 3, but also grow to really impressive numbers to the point where this deck can even keep up with things like Hela's output range when your draw really comes together. Specifically, we have Angela, Havoc, Bishop, and Sage, who all grow themselves up directly, as well as Elsa Bloodstone, who scales things in all of your paths as you start to fill things up. Another key interaction to be aware of in this deck list is that when you bast your copy of Mysterio, not only does the real Mysterio get set to 3 powers, but the clones do as well, essentially giving you 9 stats for just 2 energy, even before you start to count synergies that Mysterio provides with our other enabled cards as well. As far as Series 4 and 5 substitutions go for this deck, I think Kitty Pryde and Elsa Bloodstone are must-haves for this deck to operate at even close to efficiency, since Kitty specifically synergizes with Angela and Bishop, and Elsa just loves when you fill up the board like this deck does. As far as reasonable substitutions go, our stat sticks that are higher series, specifically Havoc, US Agent, and Sage, can be replaced by a combination of Hawkeye, Rocket Raccoon, and Wolfsbane as cards that provide stats while also benefiting from Bast. Our remaining higher series cards, Jeff, can be replaced by something like Nightcrawler that moves around the board, and Snowguard's primary purpose serves to get rid of Limbo against decks looking for a 7th turn, so you'd want to sub her out for Scarlet Witch if she's currently lacking in your collection. My final Jeff's pick this week is this Annihilus Mockingbird list that currently on your screen has Sasquatch as well as Morph in it. I used these 12 cards to win an infinite conquest with this week, but I gotta be honest, I think they would be better if Sasquatch and assuredly Morph were something else, and the stats on Untapped back that up. Specifically, this deck list that now features Cosmo as well as Juggernaut as additional tech cards, where previously Morph and Sasquatch were, has much better stats than the list featuring our newest card. I'm also not going to have any other deck list featuring Sasquatch in the roundup this week because by the numbers on Untapped and my own personal experience, Sasquatch really feels like she's the 13th or 14th best card in every list that she's shoved into. All of the Sasquatch decks that have somewhat serviceable stats are essentially established archetypes that already existed with good metrics that have had this new card shoehorned into them, that basically all have their metrics get worse with Sasquatch compared to other cards, like this list upgrading her out for things like Cosmo and Juggernaut. As far as higher series substitutions go in this archetype, the deck's namesakes in Annihilus and Mockingbird are obviously not replaceable, and I would put Nico Minaru in that list of cards as well, as she not only interfaces with the hood, but she also turns things into demon, helping enable Mockingbird. This leaves us with a handful of other higher series cards, specifically Red Guardian, Nocturne, White Widow, and Jeff. All of these cards kind of fill just like generically good cards roles in this deck. Something like Red Guardian and Nocturne you can replace with other good 3 energy cards or tech cards, specifically things like Polaris, Luke Cage, and Rogue jump to mind. Jeff and White Widow, I think it's important if you're replacing one or both of these cards to keep similar energy costs to them. So things like Lizard or Medusa, for example, would be my top picks if I needed to substitute either or both of those two out. Moving along to our high potential category, we have a handful of deck lists that have really impressive stats and albeit smaller sample sizes so far on the Untapped tracker. Any of these decks could be Marvel Snap's next big thing if their performance keeps up as their sample size grows. Our first high potential deck list this week is an incredibly sweet Ronin Scar Destroyer brew. This deck list is essentially looking to set up one of 2 different endgames. Either you can curve a high power 4-drop such as a Tuma or Crossbones into a high power 5-drop like Ronin or Red Skull, so you can play Scar in tandem with a couple other 2 energy cards on the last turn of the game to spread your stats out. Alternatively, you could make big plays on turns 4 and 5 into an additional big play on turn 6, slamming down Destroyer either behind Cosmo to suppress the Destroyers on reveal or by hiding the rest of your big cards underneath an armor so they don't have to worry about getting blown away. This deck list actually doesn't have many Series 4 and 5 cards in it. The namesake Scar obviously not being replaceable as a flexible stat stick, which leaves us just Jeff the Baby Landshark, who largely exists here as a high quality 2 energy play. So you could swap it out for another Series 5 card like White Widow, or you could obviously use a lower series card like Lizard or Medusa that's going to give you solid stats on the second turn of the game, letting you more easily set up Crossbones. Our next high potential deck list is a Thor tech deck that has appeared in this category before, but never really seems to gain any traction in terms of meaningful play rate despite its solid metrics off and on. The base game plan here is relatively straightforward. Ideally, you want to curve Thor into Beta Rebuild into Jane Foster, draw those hammers out of your deck, and to slam down those extra stats in a flurry of tech cards in the last turn of the game to break your opponent's sandcastle in whichever way is most fitting. Whether it's Killmonger blowing away 1-drop, Shang-Chi or Shadow King chopping down large things, or Red Guardian turning off their lowest power tool, this deck list has a ton of brutal interactive cards in it. In addition to being interactive, your last turn can also just be supplying more stats onto the table. Miss Marvel pairs really well with your hammers to make sure you have 2 cards on each of your side lanes. Maximus can provide 6 stats for just 2 energy, and Quake can swap locations around in a way that makes things difficult for your opponent to predict. As far as Series 4 and 5 cards go in this deck list, I think Beta Ray Bill and Miss Marvel are pretty important for this deck to have an adequate amount of stats on that last turn of the game. Mobius is a pretty unique tech card, but if you don't mind punting a matchup like Loki, you could definitely substitute him out for another disruptive element like Luke Cage. Red Guardian definitely substitutes for some ongoing interaction like Enchantress or Rogue, and then Jeff the Baby Landshark could just be another quality 2 energy card like Medusa or Lizard. Our last high potential deck list this week is an oldie but a goodie in Discard Collector. I'm not surprised to see this deck back on the up and up with Lockdown absolutely dominating the format in terms of performance and play rate that we'll get to in a minute. This deck list has always been pretty solid into Lockdown as a deck because cards like Morbius, Collector, and Dracula all deploy onto the board at really energy efficient rates and then scale up, making them excellent against the format's greatest villain in Professor X. While this archetype does not have many Series 4 and 5 cards in it, I would argue that Proxima Midnight and MODOK are not optional. They both make this deck a lot more powerful when you have access to them. Corvus Glaive could be a card that you could definitely take or leave, substituting it out for a few different things that I'll discard additional cards. I would say Colleen Wing and Hellcow definitely being at the top of that list, with something like Moon Knight getting an honorable mention if you're inclined to play that because you have a sweet variant for it. Moving along to our top performers this week, we have a Nomura Scar deck that was actually a high potential list last week. It's picked up a ton in sample size since then, and its performance metrics have not dropped off in that time period. It's very easy to see why this deck list is performing so well. You have curves that generate really impressive stats, something like Nocturne into Captain Marvel, into Nomura on 5, into Scar, plus a 10 power 4-drop like Crossbones in the last turn of the game, as well as incredibly powerful disruptive cards like Shadow King and Enchantress to kick your opponent's sandcastle, as well as Armor and Luke Cage to prevent your own. You add a little pinch of Quake on top of all that to get absolutely massive blowouts when you're likely to have priority on the last turn of the game with useful locations, and you have a recipe for powerful success. As far as Series 4 and 5 cards go, Nomura and Scar, the deck's namesakes, are obviously not replaceable, which leaves us with Nocturne, who I think if you had to sub her out, you want to replace her with something like either Gladiator or Polaris, i.e. a 3 energy card that when you power it up with Nomura, it gets 10 plus stats to discount Scar. Our next top performer this week is a Blink deck that actually made me do a double take to make sure I was looking at the data after Leech was changed, and I was. This deck list is playing 5/5 Leech to great success. Essentially, Blink in tandem with Jubilee allows you to consistently get at powerful top-end cards like Red Hulk and Magneto to slam game-winning points into play, while the 6 cards at the top of this deck list are all just really efficient and slightly disruptive 1, 2, 3 energy cards to play out in the early turns of the game to make sure we have enough numbers to close out at the end. While this particular deck list is playing a massive glut of Series 4 and 5 cards, I would go so far as to say Blink is the only one that's absolutely necessary, since she's going to give you a nice element of consistency getting at our 5 and 6 energy cards at the top end of our curve. Red Hulk can substitute out for another 6 energy bomb, such as Doctor Doom, Giganto, or regular Hulk, and then our Nebula, White Widow, Jeff, Red Guardian, Nocturne could all be changed out for a mixture of cards you just play out proactively on the early turns of the game while being a little bit disruptive. Things like Iceman, Lizard, Medusa, Luke Cage, Mobius, Polaris, these types of effects that when you have them in hand and it's the early turn of the game, you can always play them out. The types of things you should be looking to fill these slots in if you're missing any of them. Our next top performer is Elsa Kitty Movers. This deck's game plan is relatively straightforward. Its ideal setup is Angela and Elsa in the same path, and then you fill this lane up, ending in cards like Jeff the Baby Landshark, Nocturne, and even Vision to get that Elsa bonus applied and then be able to fan it out across the board to wherever it is most profitable for you to use. This deck list absolutely loves leveraging Hope Summers as well to give you extra energy so you can keep playing Kitty Pryde in and out, while also deploying larger threats like Vision and Red Hulk. As far as core Series 4 and 5 cards go, once again, Elsa, Bloodstone, and Kitty Pryde really aren't replaceable in any deck in which they're contained, and I would make the strong argument that Hope Summers is critical in this deck as well for the extra energy that she provides. Red Hulk can easily substitute out for something like Magneto, and then our trio of cheat movers, specifically Jeff, Silk, and Nocturne. It's important, I think, that you have at least one of these 3 cards, with the other 2 being interchangeable with cards like Nightcrawler and Polaris that provide some movement synergy for triggering things like Kraven while also working with Elsa Bloodstone in a pinch. As always, we close out with our most popular category, which is once again a hybrid, since the most popular decks are also among the best performing decks in Marvel Snap right now, kicking off with Ravonna, Professor X, Cannonball, Lockout. As far as must-have Series 4 and 5 cards go for this deck, Ravonna Renslayer is the only must-have in my opinion. Cannonball substitutes for Shang-Chi, Red Hulk substitutes for Magneto, and White Widow cleans up nicely with something like Mojo that plays on curve while also providing reasonable stats. Finally, we close out with Hela in our top performing / most popular category. I just wish I had more interesting decks to highlight here, but this is what all the data on the public tracker shows, and it reflects my experience. This deck is frustrating to play against, but it's quite good, and it's quite consistent with tools like Corvus Glaive and Blink that it's gained over the last few months. I honestly think Second Dinner does an incredible disservice to the player base and their game as a whole, having a deck like this be one of the premier decks in the format. Marvel Snap has so many deeply interesting and strategic gameplay strategies that constantly having this casino deck floating around as both popular and top performing feels like it makes the game out to be something it often isn't, which is frustrating and annoying. Comments about Professor X and Hela aside, there's definitely a lot of different things that are finding success in Marvel Snap right now. As always, I'd love to know what your best decks have been in the comments down below. And as always, if you enjoyed my roundups and musing, be sure to snap that like button to help this video reach some more people. And we'll see you back again here real soon for some more Marvel Snap content here on YouTube.